Hey, everybody. Welcome. It's May 1st. I think it's May Day today, and I wanted to do a little quick check-in so I can let everybody know what happened this week with our budgets and all of our fun stuff that we did this week. We talked a lot. The Hamden Legislative Council heard from many people this week with regard to the agenda that we all went through on Tuesday and actually Monday's meeting, which we didn't really have to. There's a lot of special. There was a special meeting this week, and then we also had our regular meeting, our budget meeting, which was yesterday. So let's just jump right in on some of the things that we learned this week. On the 28th, we heard about there was multiple contracts that were made public. We understand that the board of ed is going to start working on the roof at the high school. As everybody knows, the high school roof has been leaking for a long time. There's little buckets and things all over in the building to catch water. So we're really happy to hear that is on its way to being taken care of. They are going to use some cash from the sale of the Wintergreen building and use also then bond out the rest of the money. They're going to actually borrow the money and do the rest of that renovation to that roof. Very important. Past due, way past its useful life, a problem. So another thing we heard from today, this week, which was really important to me, was an update from Haley Aldrich on the Newhall Foundation's work. As you know, the foundation work was started in 2010 through 2015 through Hamden Economic Development Corporation, from what I can understand. There was work that was done from the contractor that was hired then. That work has failed since, and people are now getting more water and more moisture in their basement than they've ever had. Haley Aldrich was hired, I believe, before I got on the council. I'm not too sure. I think the contract was negotiated and approved for them to come out and do assessments of the current status of what we currently have out there. There's a zone, geographical zone, that was determined by the Connecticut Department of Environmental Protection, that said this is the zone of the area that should be worked on. And so Haley Aldrich was hired to go out and do assessments. And then there was also $1.7 million of ARPA money to do any work, I guess, emergency work, maybe, I don't know. But we've already paid, we've entered into a contract, I believe, with Haley Aldrich for $1.8 million to do assessments. When they came to the meeting on this week, they couldn't confirm anything, really. I mean, I don't know really if I rolled the tape back and I kind of skipped through and I tried to see if we can get some sort of confirmation for the owners down in Newhall and find out when are they going to be done with this phase of the assessments. Their original documentation said it would be May that they would be done with the assessments, and then they would move on to creating a design so that the design work would be able to tell us how much, is it going to cost. We can put it out to bid, get a construction manager. Construction manager has not been hired yet. The design process, the way I think I heard, hasn't started. So they're still in the assessment phase. So this assessment phase, they said it's gone on for 6 months. I think it's gone on. It's started a little bit earlier than that, I think. Bottom line is we left this meeting not knowing anything more than we were. And what I did is I took the weekly reports the weekly update reports, which there's no narrative to tell us what any of those numbers even mean. And it's also put on the town's website in the economic development tab. Again, not easy to find. Don't really know what the narrative, without a narrative, some sort of information, a narrative to explain to us the progress of the foundations. The bottom line here is not one foundation has been fixed out of that ARPA money since it arrived here, I believe, in 2021. Not one foundation has been fixed. And that's problematic for me because I got people over here in my district that are calling me and texting me on a regular basis. I can't even give them any answers because what we got on this week from Haley Aldrich really wasn't conclusive. Like, we couldn't nail them down on any kind of dates or anything. The other problem I have is that Haley Aldrich did two things that was problematic with me. is that they said that they have been, oh, we've been working with the town of Hamden for 25 years. Now, what does that say about the procurement process here in Hamden? There's no other engineering firm that's local to Connecticut or local to the area, the New Haven County area, that could have come out and done this work. And why does the town keep selecting Haley and Aldrich every time they have a project? How do they keep getting selected? Just a question, just some of those things that make you go, that's the first problem. The second thing is that one of the gentlemen from Haley and Aldrich said, we've been working very hard, and why would we need to send out certified letters to people who are on the tax record? So I get a tax bill to my house. And the best way, if I move out of this house and I decide to rent it out, the best way to find me as the owner is to send any kind of notification to the same address that you send my tax bills. And to kick it up a notch, send a certified mail. That way you know I got it. Nothing was sent certified mail to the owners of record. And the housing authority, who owns 2 properties over there, the Hamden Housing Authority owns 2 properties on Moore Street. Those 2 properties, I called her, our executive director, Hazel Ann Cook. She said she hasn't heard anything. They haven't received anything. She said she checked with her people in her office down on Worth Street, on Worth Ave, to find out has anything come in. She said she hadn't received anything. So I sent her the questionnaire and said, please fill it out, email it immediately so you can have your properties assessed as well. One of the gentlemen from Haley and Aldrich stood over us and lied and said, oh, yeah, they're government properties. They declined wanting to have an assessment. That was not true. So he volunteered this information, not understanding why that was so important to bring that up. It wasn't true. So I'm really questioning how hard and how effective Haley Aldrich has been in this quest to track down owners. They also said on record on this meeting this week that they were only planning on getting to 1/3 of the homes, which would be about 100 homes. But they were even happy that they got to 153 homes. So what about the other 147 folks? Where are they? Or 150 folks that are left? I'm really troubled by this whole process. I'm troubled by the lack of transparency, the pitiful reporting, and the fact that we're going to spend $1.8 million for this, and we can't get anybody to give us any definitive dates and times when they're going to actually start doing anything. So that's a problem. We also heard from, various people came and gave public comment. Stockley Clark came and gave public comment about our current budget process. And I'm going to talk about that in a few minutes because I also wanted to bring up what Mr. Milone said last night, which was very, very enlightening as he continues to dive into our finance department and our current budget as he compared our budget, this year's budget, to previous year's budgets. So there was a lot of things that came up that Stockley Clark mentioned. He said that he was on the Finance Commission. He had been working with Christian McNamara and various others last year on our budget from 2025, what that would look like. One thing that he did mention that I do agree with is something that we should be looking at. He said that we should be looking at some of the union contracts and change some of the language so it's not mandatory employee manning of certain posts and positions. He was saying that we should change some of the language from must to shall. You shall have 22 firefighters on. This is just for illustration purposes. He was explaining that just some of the tweaks in the language would help to save the money that we're paying out and some of the labor costs that we're actually facing right now. But what we found out last night was when we spoke to Mr. Grello, Attorney Grello, who does our negotiations with our union leadership and the union reps, is that no one from our town leadership works with him on negotiating these union contracts. And I wanted to make sure I made that clear. And you can go back and watch a video. Attorney Grello explained that he works with the department heads. He said he works with the police chief, he works with the fire chief, he works with the department head for public works, and they come together and negotiate what's best goes into the contract. Now, from the last time I looked on that ballot that we all bubbled names in 2023, I don't saw the police chief or the public works department head or the fire chief on that ballot. I saw our mayor. I saw our mayor and the administration, our town's executive was on there. So what fascinates me is that, as Mr. Clark, Saki Clark mentioned in his comments about just slight tweaks to the union contracts and maybe negotiating some things differently going forward, that's not really even a part of the process. Our town's executive, according to Mr. Grello last night, is not at the negotiation table. And I also found out last night that Mr. Grello, we don't even have a contract with him. He's on an hourly rate. And I'm sure, like he said, he gets hired on an hourly rate based on his expertise. That's troubling, because what are his marching orders? What determines that his work for us is successful? If we don't outline the parameters of success on the union contract negotiations through some sort of written agreement, then how in the world do we know that he's actually executing the duties that we're wanting to get done? I recommended that we needed a contract, and he kind of flippantly said last night, "Oh, I don't need a contract." Listen, we have to continue to dig down. This budget process is not just your regular, we're going to go through the budget and this is what you need. We're really on this is an investigation to see where we are as a town, and really dig in and find out how, every time we hear about budgets, the first thing everyone says is, "Oh, well, these are union contracts and we can't do anything about them." I don't know if I agree with that, because our process is designed right now that we actually don't even have the the folks that we elected at the table when these things are being negotiated. That's a problem that needs to be looked at and looked into thoroughly. So going back to my next set of notes, just go on here. I don't want to take up too much time. About 13 minutes in. So we heard from the cultural overview from Director Bivens. She explained to us about fireworks and things that money we were receiving from Quinnipiac for fireworks. However, Quinnipiac does not give or donate money to the town for the ancillary items that have to be paid for when we have fireworks and silver bells. And we don't really even know what that price tag is right now. I did mention that, we do have Public Works, PD, and Fire all on overtime for these programs. How much does that cost us? Is it $100,000? Is it $500,000? Is it $200,000? Is it $50,000 for these one night events? Because it all has to be factored in. You have the firework pyro work, the actual fireworks itself. Yeah, that's $30,000. But what are the other items? When you go to the fireworks, it's thousands of people. You've got fire, you've got the EMT, you've got the police directing traffic. What is it costing us? I would love to know what that total price tag is before we decide we want to just axe it. We also continue to find out that there's other sources of revenue that are coming in that are not listed on the budget. Now, Director Bivens mentioned that there's a Puticom foundation or trust that we have that we receive money from that helps out with some of her programs. But it's not, if you go to that section in the budget, it's not in there. There's, a lot of money being used in other grant areas that is not listed in the budget. I mean, there's other revenue streams. We found out that we've sold a couple of properties that were tax sales, I believe. The Ailing property was sold, but Attorney Gruen did not have the price of the money that we received off the top of her head, didn't bring it to the meeting, but did mention that there were 2 properties that were sold, one of which was on 922 Winchester Avenue that was sold for $1 to, I believe, a nonprofit in New Haven, and the Alling property, which led to the next conversation about that we have $18 million of outstanding unpaid tax liens. And that leads me on to Mr. Michael Milone, who came in and spoke about his investigation that he's working on, trying to work with the finance department to figure out where we are with our budget, what a phase in looks like, how that works. And he's doing it. He's going to have to do it really quickly because the phase in really should have been explored last year when the reval came. When the reval numbers were actually coming in the fall of last year, the phase in should have been explored then. So we're just going to have to figure this thing out now. If we're going to do a phase in, Mr. Milone is going to have to work very hard and very quickly to get his team to get us a proposal that works. Because as you know, if you phase in the reval, that's less money that we're going to be able to ask for in property taxes. And how do we make up that difference between what our $315 million budget that was proposed by the mayor versus what we're now going to be able to collect if we only collect 25% of what the value of the reval is for this coming fiscal year 26. Let's talk about that. But I can't, before I get onto that, I want to just continue to say, I want to highlight that if you look in this budget and you go back and you watch the video, there are the directors of these departments. The librarian, it received about $300,000 worth of grant money. It is not listed anywhere in the budget anywhere. It's only showing about $8,000 worth of copy paper revenue. That's a problem. So there's a lot of revenue sources that, I ask about when I hear about them during the budget period. I'd love to know where they are, and they should be listed and offset in the department that is receiving the funds. But right now, that's not how it's being worked out. Last night, we did go over a couple line items in our budget, including the Legislative Council. For some reason, our emergency and contingency item for the Legislative Council was increased by $200,000. If you go back and you look in 2020 and 2021, the Legislative Council didn't spend any money in emergency and contingency at all. And we haven't only spent a very small portion of the $300,000 that was allocated and budgeted for the council this year. So I'm recommending not only reducing that $200,000 back to $325,000, I'm saying we even reduce it down to like $100,000. Again, if you can't explain why we need it, and if there's no thorough explanation about the future or what things that you can actually forecast could be an emergency that we might need to have this money, it doesn't make any type of sense to budget and charge the taxpayers for an extra $400,000 a year if you can't explain why you need it, number one, and if we haven't had a need for it so far, then we need to cut that down. That needs to be cut down. So because in total, there's about $600,000 worth of emergency and contingency. There's $100,000 that was put into the finance department's budget and $500,000 in the Legislative Council. I totally disagree. Don't need it. And if we have some sort of contingency, then we need to continue to not budget things that we know we're not going to use, and we have a history of not using it, or we can't explain it. I'd say reduce that item. So here is Mr. Milone's report, and I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to put it up on my screen. I'm not too sure if you're going to be able to see it because it's probably really small, but let's go for it anyway. Let's see if we can find it. I'm going to share my screen. I'm going to bring it up, and let's look at it. Okay, now I know that's small. Let's see if I can make it a little bigger so everybody can maybe see it. Let's make it a little bigger over here. Okay, All right, so this was what Mr. Mylone prepared for us last night. And this was very, very, very interesting. Because as you know, one of the questions that we have been asking of this whole budget process, um, we want to know what we've been trying to figure out is what in the world happened in 2025, okay? From 2025 to 2026 that would cause such a huge jump in the ask of money that we need in property taxes, right? So Mr. Mylone put together this wonderful comparison here, and it went from 2021, 2022, 2023, 4, 5, and now the proposed for 26. So for this one, it is telling us that property taxes represented in 2021 80% of what it costs to run our town. But in 2026, in the proposed budget, it only represents 75%. So that was a good thing. There's other revenue somewhere coming from somewhere that is being used in this fiscal year 26. But here's the bigger problem. If you look in 25, our tax revenue from the taxpayers went down by 4 million. But it jumps to $23 million in fiscal year 26. So, as everybody went through their questions, I started making my notes. And he listed down, I don't know if you can see down here on the bottom, where it says 7.8 million, 657, 880, 652, and 2.965. Now, out of the fiscal year 25 budget to balance it, the budget, we budgeted the use of that wonderful fund balance that we keep talking about. That's the rainy day fund. That's our little savings account. That's the money that we have to put into a little account. And we all, before I got on the council, there was an ordinance put in place that says that that account should never go below 7% of the current budget. So because it was over and there was apparently there was money available in it to use without impacting that 7%. Last year, we budgeted the use of those funds to balance our budget. And the use of those funds, along with the 2.9 million, and we found out that 2.9 million that's also was listed in the budget from 2025. That 2.5 million represents the sale of the Wintergreen building. Now that 2.9 million did not get put into general operations because that money had to be given and was given to the Board of Ed so they can use those funds to fix the roof at the high school. And then they're going to use this cash and then they're going to borrow the rest of it to do the $8 million project. So here's the $7.8 million that was borrowed last year. So isn't that something? So you decreased the ask from year to year. So from 2024, we asked the taxpayers for 229 million, but in 2025, we only asked for 225 million. But we created an artificial deduct in taxes because we really used our rainy day fund to balance the budget. That's a little interesting, right? Doesn't that make you wonder? So why would we borrow money from our rainy day fund of $7.8 million just to show a decrease in taxes? Well, that's wonderful, right? Because we used the surplus that was in the rainy day fund, the fund balance. That's the whole point, is if we have money in the fund balance that we can use, it reduced what we needed to ask the people. That's why last year's taxes, the fiscal year that we're in right now, didn't go up. So, but now we look in the next year, this year, there's nothing being budgeted coming out of the fund balance. Because I think from the last report, and even Mr. Mylone said it last night, the report that he received said that we're right at the 7% number. So right now, from what we believe, there's no money to borrow from or use from the fund balance at this time to balance this year's budget. So Why do why do we go from a reduction in tax ask and increase it by $23 million now? Now we're asking for $23 million more than we asked for in 2025. Well, Mr. Milone says that part of that is from the 7.8 million that was borrowed. See, that was a gap that was a budget gap in 2025. So that budget gap still exists over here that's being made up by the $23 million. Okay. So get your little handy calculator out. Let's get our calculator out. Let's look at it. So if we take the 23 million, which is the additional increase that's being asked of us in this year, 327, 283, we minus out the 7.880, 652. That comes out to 15,446,000. Okay, that's the $15 million. That's a $15 million difference. So if you take out the use, since we can't use 7.8 million this year to actually balance our budget, so we have to take that out of there. That is what that 23 million represents portion of it, the 7.8 million. But then I went to go and look as well. You take out the 2.9 million, which is also what was coming in 2025. So if you take that 2.9 million out, you now are down to the 12,000,004. Okay. Now, if you remember that number, that $12 million, 12,000,000.4 number, that number is a familiar number because when I look back at my notes, that was the same number that Mr. Rick Galarza gave us for this year, 2025, as the amount that was used of ARPA money to pay for salaries, public works, fire, and police. So that 12.4 number is what the difference is in 2025 that is being used right now to balance our budget with regard to salaries. Okay. So from that 12.481 number, we minus out the $5 million in traffic camming revenue that was budgeted in 2025 that never happened. That's unrealized revenue. We have not received 1 cent of it. You take that out, that's 5 million. That brings you down to $7.4 million. Okay. And now the $7.4 million, where does that come from? Okay. That comes from just the natural increase that we would have if we just didn't have anything else causing us an increase. The 7.4 million is most likely the increase in salaries, the increase in some of the union wages, the increase in just overall operations. So really, our expenses increased by 4%, which is normal. But the reason, so the 7.4 million is normally what our increase would be, which might be maybe $1.5 million. But because we're making up all of these fundings, these revenue sources from the previous year that was not be budgeted this year, it's coming from us, the taxpayer. So this 23,327,283 is making up the difference in the borrowing of the money from the fund balance from 2025, excuse me, the year we're in now, the 2.9 million that was in the fund balance but had to be moved out because that had to go to the Board of Ed for it was their money from the sale of the Wintergreen building. We have $5 million worth of unrealized traffic cam revenue, which we never got. We're not going to, no way we're getting 5 million between now and June 30th because camera's not even up. And then you have the natural progression of just 4% increase in operations of 7.4 million. That is what comes out to the 23,327,283. So what are we going to do? And I agree with Mr. Milone. There was one thing that he did recommend, which was a really interesting option, was to recommend that we take some of our unpaid tax liens and maybe sell them and use that as a temporary crutch to figure out how we can fill this really $15 million gap, or maybe $12 million. We got about a $12.4 million operating gap that we need to fill. Um, right now, it's a $23 million gap. And that's why I believe our taxes are going up so high. So even if you're asking for 248, 471, I'm not too sure if that is enough to fill this $23 million gap. And because this gap has got to come from us, this gap's got to come from our taxes. So what my recommendations were, and I really appreciated that he said you can do a tax sale, selling that IOU to an investor, and we can decide, which one of those $18 million worth of tax liens that we currently have that we might be able to sell and be able to cash them out and use that cash to fill some of this gap so it doesn't have to hit our homes and our pocketbook so hard. But I think the bigger issue is that we can't continue on this road. We just can't. I mean, I want to show you that in 2022 here, there was also a $26 million jump in taxes, in property taxes. So it was a $10 million jump in 21, but in 22, it jumped $26 million. And then back down again to 4 million in 2023. And I agree with Mr. Milone. We need to really forecast this better. You can't, it's difficult for people to have these huge increases in our property taxes in 2022, and then 2026, 4 years later, we're doing it again. It all needs to be looked at thoroughly. And I really, we all frowned last year on this $5 million of traffic cam revenue, which turned out to be unrealized. If you can't use unrealized revenue to balance, or revenue that is not revenue that actually is something that we can actually depend on. We can't use that revenue in 1 year, because then the next year, kind of like duty calls. You have to actually now have to find that money somewhere, and it's being, if we reduced it by $4 million last year and used the fund balance, well, that was like a crutch to get us to 2026. Now, what are we going to do to get to 2027? What happens to 2027? Because we won't have tax liens to sell. We won't have fund balance to use, because I believe we're at the 7%. We're right there at the brink where we can't borrow. We can't use any more of those funds. So what do we do? Which leads to my argument that we really need to do more future-looking financial projections. I'm going to take this down and close this little meeting out here. What are we doing to really look at projections and really project what we're going to be and where we're going to be in the future? Because if you're asking for 23 million this year to fill these gaps that we mentioned during yesterday's call, which is borrowing from the fund balance, unrealized traffic cam revenue that we never received, the 4% increase in operations just overall. How do we minimize that? But it just kind of shows that we have a gap in our operating and how we operate our town. We got to look at that gap. We got to honestly look at it and say that we have to really sit down, talk to all the folks in the union. We got to talk to all of our non-union people. We've got to talk to everybody and show them what we're dealing with. I don't think it's insurmountable. I don't think it's anything that can't be fixed, but we got to really face it. We got to look it in the eye and stare it down and decide how we're going to really get this thing under control. Because what Mr. Milone illustrated with his sheet yesterday, it really was kind of disturbing. The budget increase only went up about 4.8%, but the ask to the people went up astronomically. It went down $4 million in 25 to up 23 million in 26. That is not a stable movement. And we've got to stabilize our town and our town's finances, and it's got to be stabilized as soon as possible. I'm not too sure that a phase in is really the answer. Um, I think the operations and how much it's costing to run our town, that is probably what needs to be looked at. And we really, we have a lot of things we have to really look at. Just like, Councilwoman Kylie said last night, we have to look at it ethically. But we also have to look at it ethically with regard to how this kind of erratic budgeting, $10 million increase in 21, 22, $26 million increase, negative increase in 25, and then back up to 23 million. Ethically, we got to look at why is our town so unstable in what it's asking for in its operations. What's causing that instability in our operations? Why is this continuing to happen? And so we need to continue to look at it and really come together as a town and figure out what can be done to really stabilize the growth rate in our expenses, and the growth rate in the ask and the use of other sources of revenue that are caught that are just basically filling a gap, temporarily filling a gap. I do agree with Mr. Milone again for 18 million for maybe cashing in some of that and using those funds to try to fill this year's gap. But what about 2027? And what does 2028's gap look like? And I think that we should have Mr. Milone or other financial professionals come in and really start to do some forward-looking projections on where we're going to be, because we can't keep springing these huge tax increases on folks on an annual basis. It's not right, it's not fair, and it's not ethical. So thank you so much. I will continue to drop information in as I get it. Again, this 23,327,283 is primarily what's causing this big increase in the ask for top property taxes this year. We got to talk more about how do we address these gaps in our operating budget. Thank you so much, everybody. Have a fabulous afternoon, and I'm going to head back to work. Take care.